Sarah walked into the courthouse with a calm demeanor, but inside she was fighting a storm of emotions she had never imagined she'd feel standing in front of a judge over something as trivial as a speeding ticket. As she waited in line to check in, she couldn't help but notice the stares of others in the waiting room, their eyes scanning her from head to toe. The quiet whispers that followed her every move felt all too familiar. They were the same kind of stares she had grown used to all her life, the kind that made her feel small and invisible at the same time. It wasn't new, but it always managed to sting just a little more each time. She tried to shake off the feeling, reminding herself that today wasn't about them. It was about the fine she had received while driving through a neighborhood on her way to a lecture. She had been running late, and with the clock ticking, she had inadvertently sped through a school zone. She hadn't noticed the flashing lights or the speed signs in her rush to make it to her students. She wasn't proud of it, but she knew it wasn't intentional. Still, she had been issued the ticket, and now here she was waiting for her moment in court. As her name was called, she stood up slowly and walked toward the courtroom doors, her shoes clicking against the polished floors. Each step felt heavier than the last. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. People sat in rows behind wooden benches, their faces a mix of anxiety and indifference. The judge was seated on his raised platform, behind a large desk. In front of him, a stack of paperwork lay neatly arranged, as if ready to be dealt with. In his eyes, Sarah could already sense the coldness that she had anticipated. She took her place at the defendant's table, feeling the eyes of everyone in the room shift towards her. For a brief moment, she met the judge's gaze, but quickly lowered her eyes to avoid the uncomfortable scrutiny. She had become so accustomed to growing up in predominantly white spaces, she had always felt like she was being judged for things she couldn't control: the color of her skin, her natural hair, the way she dressed. Today, she was dressed professionally in a tailored blazer and a crisp blouse, her hair pulled back into a neat bun, but none of that seemed to matter. The judge, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and an air of authority, cleared his throat and glanced at the file in front of him before looking at Sarah. For the first time since she had entered the room, his eyes were indifferent, as if she were just another case, another number to process, with no consideration for who she truly was, no thought to the fact that she had spent years earning advanced degrees and establishing herself as a respected scholar in her field. She knew better than to expect any of that to matter to him. She had seen it happen before, but it still hurt. He began by asking her to explain the circumstances surrounding the ticket. Sarah took a deep breath and began speaking clearly and concisely, explaining the situation in the most neutral way possible. She mentioned her work and how she had been rushing to get to her students, but she made sure to emphasize that she was aware of the violation and was willing to take responsibility for it as much as it pained her. She wanted to make it clear she wasn't looking for special treatment. The judge barely listened to her explanation. His eyes kept darting to the file in front of him, and then to the clock on the wall, as if he was already bored with the conversation. Without much hesitation, he ruled that she was to pay the fine in full. No reduction, no leniency, just a cold decision that would follow her home that day. Sarah stood there in shock for a moment before collecting herself. She was about to turn and leave the stand when she noticed the judge didn't even bother to look up from his papers. He had already moved on to the next case. It was as if she didn't matter at all, and in that moment she felt smaller than ever before. As Sarah walked out of the courtroom, the weight of the judge's decision pressed heavily on her chest. The fine was a blow, but it was more than that. It was the feeling of being dismissed, of not being seen for who she truly was. It wasn't the first time she had faced such treatment, but somehow it always seemed to hurt more each time. She had tried so hard to build a reputation in her field, to prove that she belonged to a world that didn't always make room for people like her, yet here she was being reduced to just another black woman, being judged and punished by a system that often overlooked her humanity. She stepped into the courthouse hallway, her heels echoing off the marble floors. Her mind raced as she replayed the moment in her head, each second of the judge's indifference, each glance that seemed to dismiss her presence. She felt the sting of his assumptions, the unspoken biases that had clouded his judgment. Even as she stood there trying to explain herself, she had known deep down that her words would never change his mind. She had known from the moment she walked into that room that her chances of being treated fairly were slim at best. Sarah had always carried the weight of her identity. Wherever she went, her success in academia had never shielded her from the biases of the world around her. She had learned to navigate these spaces carefully, always having to prove herself over and over again. Despite her impressive credentials, her numerous degrees, her published works, none of it seemed to matter when she was face to face with the kind of discrimination that was all too familiar. She could feel the anger rising within her, but she knew better than to let it consume her. She had learned long ago that expressing anger in a world that already found so many reasons to dismiss her was often seen as a weakness, so she swallowed it down and focused on the next step: how to pay the fine, how to move forward without letting this experience define her. As she walked out of the courthouse doors into the cool afternoon air, she pulled out her phone and texted a few friends to let them know what had happened. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she typed the words, but no matter how many times she hit backspace, she couldn't seem to put it into words. Nothing felt right. Nothing could fully capture the feeling of being judged without being seen. It wasn't until later that evening, when Sarah was meeting with colleagues at a local cafe, that the conversation turned to her experience in court. One of her friends who knew Sarah well asked her casually how it had gone. Sarah took a deep breath and began to recount the details of her day. She mentioned the judge's attitude, how he barely seemed to listen to her, how dismissive he was. But what struck her friends the most wasn't the fine itself. It was Sarah's background, that they hadn't even realized the extent of her accomplishments. One of them, a fellow academic, asked with genuine curiosity why the judge hadn't seemed to acknowledge that she was a respected scholar in her own right. As Sarah spoke about her research and the work she had done over the years, she realized that while she had always been proud of her achievements, she rarely talked about them in public. It wasn't that she was ashamed of them, but she had learned early on to keep such things private, especially in environments where she felt her identity might overshadow her accomplishments. It was a defense mechanism that allowed her to navigate a world that often didn't know how to make space for her. But now, as she spoke with her colleagues, it became clear to her that her story wasn't just hers to carry anymore, and that maybe it was time to let the world see her for what she truly was. One of her friends, a fellow professor, smiled and said, "Sarah, you should really make sure people know about this. You've earned every single bit of respect that comes with your work. People should know who you really are and what you've done. Your story matters too much for it to go untold." Her words echoed in Sarah's mind long after their conversation had ended, and that night, as she lay in bed staring up at the ceiling, she made a decision to let go of the shame and the silence she had carried for so long. Days passed, and the weight of the courtroom incident lingered in Sarah's mind, but slowly something began to shift inside her. What started as anger and frustration began to morph into determination. She had never been the type to dwell on a setback for long, but this was different. This wasn't just about a fine. It was about a lifetime of being overlooked and dismissed. It was about the subtle prejudices she had faced in her career and the way they had shaped her view of herself and her place in the world. But now she was ready to confront that feeling head-on. Sarah decided to reach out to a few of her colleagues in academia, people she trusted and respected, and share the story of what had happened to her in court. She wasn't looking for sympathy, but rather to give them a glimpse into her world, the world she often kept hidden behind the professional facade of lectures and research papers. When they heard her story, they were stunned, not just by the judge's actions, but by the fact that none of them had known the full extent of her achievements. They had always admired her for her intellect, but none of them realized how much she had accomplished beyond what they saw on a daily basis. One of her colleagues, a senior professor who had mentored her for years, suggested that it was time Sarah made her story known to a wider audience. It wasn't just about the judge's mistake. It was about changing the narrative and fighting against the stereotypes that often clouded people's perceptions of black women in academia. The conversation struck a chord with Sarah, and she began to realize how much more she could do if she stopped hiding behind her own hesitations. Sarah knew the process wouldn't be easy. She had spent years carefully building a reputation that was solely focused on her work and the impact she had on her field, but now it was clear that it was impossible to separate her identity from her work. No matter how hard she tried, her identity as a black woman was integral to her story, and it was time to embrace that part of herself without fear. The first step was subtle. Sarah updated her online professional profiles, adding details about her community involvement and speaking engagements that highlighted the broader impact of her work. She shared snippets of her journey as a scholar who had overcome obstacles and biases to reach where she was now. She didn't make a big announcement or declare any grand intentions, but something inside her began to shift as she began to share more openly about who she was beyond the surface. Soon after Sarah's story began to gain traction within her circles, colleagues started to take notice and word spread across the academic community. People who had never fully understood the extent of her accomplishments began to reach out in support. Some even shared their own stories of discrimination and bias in their fields, opening up a dialogue that Sarah had never anticipated. In some ways, it felt like a weight had been lifted, as if by sharing her experiences, she had created a space where others could also share their own struggles and victories. One afternoon, a journalist from a well-known academic publication reached out to Sarah after hearing about her work and her recent experiences in the courtroom. The journalist was writing a piece about bias and discrimination in the legal and academic systems and wanted Sarah's perspective. It was a moment that felt both surreal and empowering for Sarah. As she sat down for the interview, she realized that her story had finally found an outlet in a way that would have a wider impact than she ever expected. She wasn't just one woman telling her story in private anymore. She was part of a larger conversation about justice and recognition. The journalist listened intently as Sarah described the events that had led to her fine and the emotion she had felt in the courtroom. She talked about how it wasn't just about the fine, but about the assumptions made based on her appearance and her identity as a Black woman. Sarah spoke candidly about the ways in which academia and the legal system often failed to see people like her for who they truly were and the toll that took on her. But in sharing her experience, Sarah began to feel more seen than she had in years. It was as though her voice was finally being heard, and it felt like the first step toward reclaiming the respect that had so often been denied her. A few weeks later, Sarah found herself thinking more and more about the judge and the way he had treated her that day in court. As her story began to resonate with others, she couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to confront him, not for revenge, but to address the larger issue of bias and judgment that had colored his actions. She was aware that it wouldn't be easy, and that the judge likely wouldn't even remember her face after so many cases. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized how important it was to show him the person he had dismissed that day in the courtroom was not just a defendant, but a woman with a story that mattered. One afternoon, Sarah called her lawyer and asked if it would be possible to have a private meeting with Judge Adams. She wasn't sure how he would respond, but she knew it was something she needed to do. The lawyer was surprised at first, but agreed to help facilitate the meeting. After some back and forth with the court system, a date was set, and Sarah prepared herself for what would be an uncomfortable yet necessary conversation. She knew the judge wouldn't be expecting her, and she wondered how he would react when he saw her again. The day of the meeting, Sarah arrived at the courthouse with a sense of calm determination. She wore a simple yet professional outfit and carried herself with the quiet confidence she had learned to embrace in recent years. When she stepped into the judge's office, she saw him seated behind his desk, his face unreadable, but he stood up when she entered the room, and for a moment there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He quickly masked it with a neutral expression, as if he were bracing himself for a routine exchange. Sarah introduced herself with a firm handshake and sat down across from him. The atmosphere was tense and heavy with unspoken words, but she took a deep breath and began speaking directly to him. She explained who she was and shared her background as a scholar and educator. She spoke about the work she had done in the field of social justice and the academic community, the long hours of research and teaching that had shaped her into the person she had become. She told him about her passion for empowering others and how her identity had always been intertwined with her work. She then addressed the day they had met in court, telling him how deeply his actions had affected her. She spoke about the way he had dismissed her without truly listening, and how that was a reflection of larger societal biases that Black women often faced in spaces that were supposed to be fair and impartial. She wasn't accusatory, But her words were firm and clear. She explained how his actions weren't just about a fine, they were about a larger system that often made it harder for people like her to be seen for who they truly were. Judge Adams listened quietly, his expression unreadable as Sarah spoke. He didn't interrupt or defend his actions, he simply let her words sink in. As she finished, he looked at her for a long moment before speaking. Sarah could tell that he was processing what she had said, as if he had never considered the full impact of his actions. Before he sighed and looked down at his hands for a brief moment before meeting her eyes again and saying something that surprised her. "I didn't realize what I was doing. I didn't see you for who you really are. I see now that I made a mistake." It wasn't an apology in the traditional sense, but it was an acknowledgement, and that was something Sarah hadn't expected at all in that moment. She felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. Part of her wanted to hear a deeper apology, something more concrete, but another part of her realized that this was a first step, something that could lead to change in his own understanding of the world and how he interacted with it. They talked for a little longer, and when Sarah left the judge's office, she felt different than she had when she walked in. She didn't feel like she had won some personal victory, but rather that she had made a small crack in the wall of bias and misunderstanding that had kept so many people like her from being seen for who they truly were. Sarah knew the journey wasn't over, but this conversation had given her a sense of hope that change was possible even in the most unlikely of places. A few days after her meeting with Judge Adams, Sarah felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, but it wasn't the kind of victory she had imagined. When she first walked into the courtroom, it wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about something deeper, something more personal and transformative. She knew that confronting the judge had been important, but she also knew that the conversation with him was just a small part of a much larger journey. The real work was in how she continued to navigate the world and how others saw her now that her story was out there in the open. Sarah spent the next few weeks reflecting on the conversation she had had with her colleagues and the journalists who had reached out to her to share her experiences. She found herself thinking about her own identity in new ways as she slowly began to accept that her blackness wasn't something to hide or apologize for. It was an essential part of who she was, and it was time for the world to recognize that she wasn't just a scholar, but a whole person with a rich history and perspective that deserved to be heard. The more Sarah thought about it, the more she realized that her decision to confront Judge Adams wasn't just about challenging one person's bias. It was about creating a ripple effect in the broader systems she worked within. It was about showing up as herself unapologetically and letting others see the full extent of her humanity. She had spent so much time trying to fit into spaces that didn't always make room for people like her, but now she was determined to change that narrative, not just for herself, but for others who had been overlooked and silenced. One evening, Sarah sat down to write a piece for a well-known academic journal about the intersection of race and academia. She had been approached by the editor after the journalist interview, and the editor had encouraged her to share her perspective on how systemic racism shaped the academic landscape. She poured her heart into the article, writing not just about her experiences, but about the broader implications of bias and exclusion in education. She wrote about the challenges that students and scholars of color faced every day, the microaggressions, the assumptions, the obstacles that often went unchallenged because they were so ingrained in the system. As Sarah wrote, she began to feel a sense of liberation, like the weight that had been holding her back for so long was slowly lifting. She was no longer hiding parts of herself for fear of being judged or misunderstood. Her words flowed freely as she recounted the ways she had been denied opportunities and recognition simply because of who she was, and she made sure to emphasize that this wasn't just her story, it was the story of so many others whose voices had been drowned out by a system that valued some people over others. When the article was published, Sarah was overwhelmed by the response. It quickly went viral within academic circles, and beyond. Readers reached out from all over the world sharing their own stories of discrimination and bias in the classroom and workplace. They thanked Sarah for giving them a voice and for shining a light on the struggles they had faced in silence. It was clear that her story was resonating with so many people who had felt the same way but had never known how to articulate it. The response was humbling, But it also made Sarah realize just how much work was left to do. The conversation she had started with her article wasn't going to end with one piece or one conversation with a judge. It was part of a larger movement toward equity and inclusion, and she was determined to keep pushing the conversation forward. She began speaking at conferences and panels about race in academia, about how to create spaces that were truly inclusive of all voices, and how to challenge the biases that had long held power over the narratives of marginalized people. Sarah's journey was far from over, but as she looked back on everything she had accomplished, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had learned to embrace her identity and her story in ways she never thought possible, and she knew that by doing so she had not only changed her own life, but the lives of others too. Her voice had become a catalyst for change, and she was ready to continue using it to make the world a more just and equitable place for everyone. Sarah's new sense of purpose and identity began to take root in ways she hadn't expected. After the article went viral, she found herself being invited to speak at universities' conferences and panel discussions across the country. The requests seemed endless, and with each invitation her resolve grew stronger. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for those whose voices had never been heard, for the students and scholars who had been overlooked and dismissed because of their race, gender, or background. She realized that this was bigger than just her story. It was a movement that needed to be amplified. At one of the first conferences she attended, Sarah stood in front of a large audience of academics, professionals, and students, many of whom had reached out to her. After reading her article, she could feel the weight of their eyes on her, waiting for her to say something that would resonate with them. She stepped up to the podium and took a deep breath before beginning. She shared her personal journey from the courtroom to the academic world, from being overlooked to finding her voice. She spoke candidly about the struggles of navigating systems that were designed for people who didn't look like her, and how those experiences shaped her as a scholar and as a person. As Sarah spoke, she could see the room begin to shift. The audience was with her every step of the way. They nodded in agreement and leaned forward as if they too were waiting for something profound to be revealed. She wasn't just telling them about the challenges she faced, she was showing them that it was possible to challenge the system and create change. She spoke about the importance of acknowledging biases and breaking down barriers, and how academia and other professional spaces could be transformed if they embraced diversity and inclusion as core principles. When the panel ended and the audience began to disperse, many of the attendees approached her with gratitude. Some even shared their own stories of discrimination and exclusion in the workplace and in their educational journeys. They thanked her for giving them the courage to speak out for the first time. Sarah listened intently to each person's story, knowing that these experiences were just a small glimpse into the vast ocean of pain and frustration that so many had carried in silence for years. As she walked away from the event that day, she felt a deep sense of connection with the people she had spoken to, and with a renewed commitment to the work ahead. Sarah's newfound visibility brought about a different kind of challenge. As her platform grew, so did the scrutiny and the criticism. Not everyone appreciated the way she was challenging the status quo. Some critics tried to discredit her work and diminish her accomplishments. They labeled her as divisive or overly sensitive, dismissing the real issues she had raised as mere grievances. It wasn't surprising to Sarah. She had anticipated this backlash. It was part of the process, but it still stung to see her motives questioned in such a public way. Despite the criticism, Sarah remained focused on her mission. She knew that change was never easy, and that resistance was a natural part of challenging deeply rooted systems. She leaned on the support of her colleagues and friends, who encouraged her to keep speaking out and to continue using her voice for good. She reminded herself that the people who criticized her were the same ones who had been blind to the issues she had been talking about for so long, and they would always resist until they saw the truth for themselves. As time went on, Sarah's work began to gain traction beyond academic circles. She was invited to collaborate with organizations that focused on racial justice and inequality in education. She began mentoring young Black scholars and helping them navigate the complex academic landscape. She had once struggled with herself. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment as she saw the next generation of scholars rising up and demanding their space in a world that often tried to push them out. Through her work, Sarah continued to chip away at the walls that had been built to keep people like her from thriving, and with each step she took, she felt more empowered, more connected to her purpose. She had started this journey as a woman with a story to tell, but now she was part of a larger collective effort to create a world where everyone's voice could be heard and valued. Her story was no longer just hers to tell, it had become a beacon for others to follow, and Sarah knew she was just getting started in her quest to make the world a more inclusive place for all. As Sarah's influence grew, so did the sense of responsibility. She felt with each new invitation to speak or collaborate came an opportunity to make a deeper impact on the communities she was a part of, but it also meant more pressure to remain true to her mission and her purpose. She began to feel the weight of expectations from those who looked to her as a leader and role model. She understood why they did it, but it was a burden she hadn't anticipated at first. She had simply shared her story to make a difference, but now she realized her voice had become a symbol for something much larger than herself. There were days when Sarah felt overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the work ahead, but she always reminded herself of the reasons she started this journey: to make a difference not just for her own career, but for the countless others who had been pushed to the margins and ignored for so long. She would be lying if she didn't admit that there were times when she doubted herself and questioned whether she could keep going. But every time she faced those moments of doubt, there was something inside her that pushed her forward: the voices of those who supported her and the stories of those who had yet to find their voice kept her going. One afternoon, as Sarah sat in her office reviewing some of her upcoming projects, she received an unexpected message. It was from Judge Adams, the same judge who had fined her months earlier, and with whom she had had that difficult conversation. She hadn't heard from him since their meeting, and though she had wondered about the impact of their conversation, she hadn't expected to hear from him again in this way. The message was short and simple, but it caught her off guard. It read, "Sarah, I've been thinking a lot about our conversation since that day, and I wanted to apologize to you for the way I treated you in court. I've learned a lot, and I want to do better." At first, Sarah wasn't sure how to respond. She stared at the message for several long moments, trying to process what he had said. Part of her wanted to dismiss it as just another attempt at absolution, but another part of her felt a sense of validation she had never expected, not from him certainly, but from the system he represented. She didn't know what kind of change had happened within him, but she knew that his apology was more than just words. It was an acknowledgement that what had happened in that courtroom wasn't just an isolated incident, but part of a much larger pattern of behavior that needed to be addressed. Sarah took a deep breath before she responded. She thanked him for his message and told him that she appreciated his willingness to reflect on his actions. She let him know that while it meant something to hear him acknowledge the harm that had been done, it was just the beginning of a much larger conversation, and that the real work needed to come from a place of continued self-examination and action. She didn't expect an immediate transformation, but she hoped that their conversation would serve as a catalyst for change, not just in his own life, but in the lives of others who held positions of power. In the weeks that followed, Sarah reflected on the nature of the apology and what it meant for her own journey. She realized that the most important part of the process wasn't necessarily receiving apologies from those who had wronged her, but in using her experiences to inspire change and push for greater accountability in all areas of society. She began to see her role not just as an advocate for herself, but as someone who could help others heal and find their own voices. She knew her work wasn't done, and that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but the unexpected message from Judge Adams reminded her that change was possible, even in the most unlikely places. As she continued to speak out and advocate for justice, Sarah also began to reflect on the deeper lessons she had learned along the way. She realized that the fight for equity and inclusion wasn't just about confronting others' biases. It was also about challenging her own and confronting the ways in which she had internalized the very same systems of oppression she had spent so much time fighting against. She recognized that she too had sometimes doubted her own worth and value, but with each new experience and each new step in her journey, she was learning to trust herself more fully and embrace her own power. The message from Judge Adams served as a reminder that the process of change was never linear. It was messy and complex, But it was also deeply human, and Sarah knew that the work she was doing was worth every moment of struggle and every ounce of effort, because at the end of the day she was creating a world where people like her could be seen for who they truly were, and that was a world worth fighting for. As Sarah continued her work in academia and activism, she began to understand the full scope of her role in shaping a new narrative. It wasn't just about breaking down barriers or challenging prejudices. It was about creating an environment where people no longer had to fight for their right to be heard. She found herself increasingly in conversations with other marginalized groups who had long been excluded from the academic and professional spaces. She was working to change. She had always believed in the power of education and knowledge. But now she understood that real education was not just about teaching, but about creating spaces where every voice was valued and no one was silenced. She began collaborating with organizations that focused on creating more inclusive academic policies and workplace environments. They worked together on initiatives that encouraged diversity in hiring and promoted programs that empowered people from underrepresented communities to pursue careers in higher education and other industries. They also launched mentorship programs to help students navigate the challenges of academia, while providing them with the resources and support they needed to thrive. Sarah had never envisioned herself in this kind of leadership role, but the more she leaned into it, the more she realized that this was exactly where she needed to be. Through these collaborations, Sarah met countless students who reminded her of herself at a younger age, eager to prove their worth, but unsure if they had a place in the world they dreamed of entering. She saw so many young Black women and men who had been told their voices didn't matter, or that they didn't belong in spaces of power and influence. Yet, despite the challenges they faced, there was an undeniable spark in each of them that reminded Sarah of the fire she had within herself to change the world and create opportunities for those who came after her. Over time, Sarah found herself not only serving as a mentor, but also as a bridge between the generations. She had been mentored by those who had come before her, and now she was helping to create a path for those who would follow. She began teaching workshops and writing books focused on addressing the systemic issues in academia and beyond. She wrote about her own experiences and the lessons she had learned along the way. But she also made sure to highlight the voices of others whose stories needed to be heard just as much as hers did. The more Sarah spoke out and advocated for change, the more she realized how much power she had in shaping the world around her. She understood that her voice was a tool for transformation, and that she had the ability to reach not just those who agreed with her, but also those who were resistant to the ideas of inclusivity and equity. She wasn't interested in simply preaching to the choir. She wanted to engage with those who needed to hear the truth, even if it was uncomfortable, even if it challenged everything they thought they knew about race, privilege, and power. Sarah also found herself working with institutions that were beginning to recognize the importance of diversity and inclusion in meaningful ways. Some universities reached out to her to help them assess their own internal systems and policies to ensure they were supporting students and faculty from diverse backgrounds. Others invited her to help design curricula that would expose students to a broader range of perspectives and experiences. Sarah found these collaborations incredibly rewarding, as they allowed her to make a tangible impact on the educational system and help shape the minds of future generations. While the work was challenging and at times exhausting, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment as she saw the seeds of change she had planted beginning to take root. She watched as students who had once felt like outsiders began to step into leadership roles with confidence. She saw young scholars publishing groundbreaking research that challenged the status quo, and she saw the conversation she had started about race and inclusion expanding into areas she had never imagined. She knew that the fight was far from over, but as she looked around at the progress that had been made, she felt a deep sense of pride. As Sarah reflected on her journey from the courtroom to the academic world and beyond, she knew that the work she was doing wasn't just about breaking down barriers. It was about creating a world where those barriers no longer existed. It was about a future where people of all backgrounds and identities could walk into any room and be seen for who they truly were, no longer needing to prove their worth or fight for their place at the table. In that moment, Sarah realized that she had become part of a legacy of changemakers who were building a more just and inclusive world for all. The journey had been long and filled with challenges, but it was also one of immense growth and transformation. Sarah had gone from a woman who had been silenced and overlooked to a leader who was shaping the future, and as she continued to push forward in her work, she knew that the best was yet to come. The path ahead was still filled with obstacles, but Sarah was ready to face them head-on, knowing that every step she took brought her closer to a world where everyone could thrive equally and without fear.